Cody Bellinger is an interesting topic of discussion this offseason because he's going to command a huge contract. He's one of the only good hitters available. He's coming off a really good season, and yet none of the advanced statistics really back up his performance from 2023. So let's consider both sides of the story here and try to determine what he'll be come 2024. The case against Cody Bellinger from a pretty high level perspective is a simple one. None of the advanced statistics think he will be as good as he was in 2023 in 2024. He got great results, but he didn't really hit the ball hard or at the right angles to make a convincing case that what he did is repeatable in the traditional way that projections are built, which is what a lot of the expected stats like X-Slug or X-Woba that you see here are relying on, because historically those variables that they're considering that something as simple as average or slugging percentage might not have proven to be more stable or more predictive year over year. The big thing I want to point out on this kind of chart you're looking at right here is just the difference between slug and expected slug. You have about a 100-point gap. Slug says that he was 100 points better than the league average, where expected slug says he was right around league average. And his total offensive contribution to run production, which is a shorthand way to think of X-Woba down there, was basically, again, saying that he's like a league average hitter. But again, the results, as you see in average and slug above, were really strong, suggesting that he was well above league average. And when you go under the hood, however, things become more interesting. Bellinger clearly had, in my opinion, a specific approach with two strikes that allowed him to have results well above the major league average in a variety of these stats we just looked at, specifically in disadvantageous counts. Let's now look at Bellinger in two-strike counts. You see a very similar story with batting average at 279, well above the league average of 172, and slugging percentage, again, almost 200 points or 150 points above the league average in two-strike counts. And you run into a very similar situation here, right? As we did in looking at his season as a whole. Really strong results-based production, but again, the underlying stats aren't totally convinced that what he's doing is replicable. The main thing I want to point out here, again, we saw X-Slug and X-Woba earlier. They both kind of peg him for slightly above or at league average production. The barrel rate's an interesting one, though. A lot of other hitters who were really successful in two-strike counts, like Ronald Acuna, Kyle Tucker, Yandy Diaz, were guys that were able to barrel the ball in two-strike counts above the league average rate. And you do not see that with Cody Bellinger in two-strike counts, as he was well below the league average of 6%, posting sub 3% barrel rate. In talking to people in and around the Cubs organization and presenting them with a very similar scenario that I just presented you here, right? Looking at the results versus the expected numbers and trying to figure out why that difference is occurring. The rationale I heard as to why Cubs people thought that he would continue to have success, or it was at least a bit replicable, is that he was on plane more with incoming pitches, right? This goes back to that old Ted Williams graphic of the incoming pitch and matching plane with it for a longer period of time to potentially give you a slightly higher margin for error in your swing. The idea here from the Cubs' perspective was essentially that Cody Bellinger was kind of back from a swing standpoint to what he was doing in 2018 and 2019, minus obviously as much of the explosiveness due to the injuries in the past. Primarily, that is the reason why the exit velocities are low, but the rationale around why it would continue made sense, right? On playing more with the pitch, that makes a bit of sense, especially adjusting into two-strike counts. If he's able to do that, I understand why they maybe believe that it would continue for the most part. Unfortunately, on the public side, we don't really have attack angle metrics or anything along those lines to confirm this idea. All we have is launch angle, which leaves out some context, but I think illustrates a decent point here. Bellinger had a tendency not to air it out as much in two-strike counts. The difference between his launch angle in two-strike and non-two-strike counts dropped the 10th most, or around the 10th most in baseball, in a sample of about 430 hitters, implying that he was flattening out his swing and aiming for more line drive or ground ball contact well above the average hitter. The idea that he's living in an area of launch angle that, regardless of exit velocity, would allow him to convert more hits makes a lot of sense. I've heard from hitting coaches that there's a lot of hits in like that 9 to 13 or 14 area of launch angle, regardless of how you're hitting the ball. These are balls that generally end up as line drives slightly over the infield and prior to getting to the outfield. I don't necessarily know if that's a way to make yourself a really good hitter in baseball, but it makes sense to me that living in that area, if you could kind of tighten your standard deviation of your launch angle to live in that area where hits are created regardless of exit velocity, that you could become a productive hitter, and it makes a lot of sense. Another way to look at this two-strike adjustment is visually through heat maps from my friends at TruMedia here. The approach against Bellinger throughout most of the year was just to throw him fastballs, forcing fastballs specifically at the top of the zone. It just took the league a bit to figure that out. You can see this by looking at a pretty basic graphic of where he creates slugging percentage in the zone. there isn't much damage up in that upper portion of the zone. A deeper look at where he was swinging versus where he was creating damage against four-seam fastballs specifically shows a similar story, which I'll show right here. Swing rate versus where he actually creates damage, right? It doesn't look great. I want these two maps to look similar. Swing where you create damage. But then you toggle to his approach with 2 strikes versus four-seam fastballs. It actually looks kind of the same, if not better than it did in non-2 strike counts. That's essentially what this comes down to for any front office considering signing Cody Bellinger. Do you believe what he did in 2 strike counts is replicable next season, such that he will be able to continually outperform some of the expected metrics that expect him to regress to more league average? Is there some innate ability that he rediscovered from 2018, 2019 for him to get on plane with pitches, create more margin for error in his swing, and generate more hits in that really prime area of launching, regardless of how hard he's hitting the ball? Or do you think there's perhaps an effective counter that pitchers could take against this approach that he will not be able to then re-counter and be as successful, be the 20-30% above league average hitter that he was in the past? That is the crux of the question as to whether you want to pay him north of, say, $25 million a year. And that makes contract projection for Bellinger pretty tough. Fangraphs crowdsourced him at 6 for 144, or about $24 million per year. To me, it's pretty painful for any team to look at Brandon Nimmo's contract, which was 8 for 162, and assume that you're going to have to pay more on a total basis or average annual value basis for Cody Bellinger, when I think a lot of Brandon Nimmo's underlying statistics look probably better from a projection standpoint than Cody Bellinger's do right now. There's just less doubt in a guy like Brandon Nimmo than I think teams are going to have in a guy like Cody Bellinger, which makes me think that the market for Bellinger will be softer than the projections think it will be. I'll go bold and say that I think he gets less than $24 million average annual value a year. And I think my logic here lines up with what organizations are internally thinking. But again, with contracts, we exist in a very weird area where the average offer doesn't matter, right? Whoever pays the most is probably going to win the bidding for Cody Bellinger. So if there's 5 teams in on him, 4 of them offer $22 million a year over 7 years, 7 for 144-ish, or in that window. And then there's a 5th team that jumps in and offers $26 million a year in the same time period with, everything else being equal. Well, I would bet that the richer contract is going to win out. So even if my thinking lines up with the majority of organizations, it's only really going to take one organization to jump whatever the market value is for him, that the market is determining, and push him into a territory that, okay, then he gets, the crowdsourced projection of 6 for 144 at $24 million AAV, something along those lines. So that's the reality of how I think we think about contracts. I just think a lot of organizations internally are thinking the same thing that most analysts, I think, in the media are thinking about Cody Bellinger right now, myself included, which is just like, I think there maybe is some innate ability for him to get on plane more, and it makes some sense. I'm waiting to see what the league counter is to it and whether he counters back. I'm not entirely convinced that the explosiveness is ever going to come back in a guy like Cody Bellinger. Generally, before you hit the age of like 31, your probability of running into some bounce back season is higher than after that age. It's been some research done, I believe, by Jeff Zimmerman of Fangraphs. And, Bellinger's not at that age yet, so perhaps there's some explosiveness regain that he does have. But, after watching him for a full season, I do think there's an innate ability for him to get on plane. I'm just not entirely sure if it makes him like a 30% above league average hitter. I think it maybe nets him out to more slightly above league average, say 10% above that league average. And at that point, despite the market being very scarce on hitting, I'm not entirely sure it's worth it to pay Cody Bellinger $25+ million AAV, even with a pretty strong defense and some defensive versatility. So the big question for you now, what do you think Cody Bellinger is? What do you think he should get? Do you think his ability to get on plane in this 2-strike approach is something that's replicable? Do you think that doesn't matter? I want to know, and I want you to post in the comments. We'll have some discussion there. I'm very curious just what the market and everyone else thinks about this. And I do think it's important to state the other case here, right? The fact that if you believe something is innate and improved and better about Cody Bellinger in 2-strike counts, and that will replicate going forward, then I think you could justify the contract. But the majority of people, the analytics heads included, like myself, are pushing against that because of a lot of the underlying statistics. So now you have both sides. Let me know in the comments what you think.